So apparently Laffy Taffy's too good to sponsor History with Stevens, but I'm not worried about it because we got a new sponsor. So this episode of History with Stevens is going to be brought to you by Tootsie Rolls. They're a great snack. They may not have jokes, but we can come up with jokes ourselves here at History with Stevens. Here's one I just thought off the top of my head. What kind of music did Pilgrims like? Plymouth Rock? Get it? Get it? Because they landed on Plymouth Rock, and rock is also a type of music. It's a work in progress. I'm sorry. Howdy, howdy, it's History with Stevens.
Steven.
History with Stevens.
Steven.
Welcome back. If you remember from episode 5, fighting had broken out between the colonists and the British. The fighting in Lexington and Concord marked the beginning of the American Revolution. So on May 10th, 1775, the Second Continental Congress met in Philadelphia to decide who should lead the militias in New England. Most delegates believed it should be someone from the New England colonies, since most of the fighting was taking place in New England, and most of the people who were fighting were also from New England. However, John Adams had a different idea. He wanted Congress to create a Continental Army, full of troops from the New England colonies, the Middle colonies, and the Southern colonies. And he wanted a Virginian named George Washington to lead that Continental Army. And he wanted George Washington to lead that Continental Army for two reasons. First, he'd experienced from the French and Indian War and had proven himself to be a leader that everyone respected. Second, being from Virginia, he would make it a lot easier to unite the colonies. If they had chosen someone from New England, it would almost seem like the New England colonies were rebelling against Great Britain, rather than all the colonies, meaning the New England, Middle, and Southern colonies. When George Washington took over the Continental Army, he quickly realized they were in bad shape. They had almost no training and didn't have enough supplies. Luckily, because Washington had fought in the French and Indian War, he knew the British had an old fort called Fort Ticonderoga located in New York. Washington knew there would be supplies there, and he sent people to seize the fort and bring the weapons back to Boston. On March 4th, 1776, the Americans would force the British out of Boston. General Howe of England didn't want to risk another battle, so he left along with 1,000 loyalists. Prior to driving the British out of Boston, the Second Continental Congress sent a petition known as the Olive Branch Petition to King George. The purpose of the petition was to ask the King George to make peace with the colonists, but by the time the petition had reached Britain, King George had already said the colonies were in open rebellion, and he called the colonists traitors and said they ought to be brought to justice. They only had Instagram back then. Then they could have sent King George a DM and maybe prevented all of this, and we would be drinking tea, watching soccer matches, and all the other great things that Britain has to offer. Anyways, during this time, many colonists still weren't convinced that the colonies should try to rebel against Great Britain. Then in 1776, a patriot named Thomas Paine would publish a pamphlet called Common Sense. Common Sense made the argument that for why the colonies should support independence. He argued that people owed no loyalty to Great Britain and its king, and that being part of the British Empire only dragged them into European wars. Over 120,000 copies of Common Sense were sold in just a few months, and it influenced many colonists to support independence from Great Britain. A few weeks after, the Americans had forced the British to leave Boston. The Second Continental Congress appointed a committee to write a formal Declaration of Independence. A Virginian named Thomas Jefferson was tasked with writing this document. His job was to explain to the world why the colonists needed to break free from Great Britain. Jefferson's writings were inspired by John Locke of England and his understanding of natural rights. Locke believed that the three natural rights were life, liberty, and property. Jefferson understood those rights to be life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Jefferson argued that government only has legitimacy to govern if they are protecting those rights. Jefferson argued the king was violating those fundamental rights, and the colonists had a right to overthrow him and replace him with a new government. Jefferson wrote extensively about the king's abuses. Jefferson stated that King George taxed the colonists without their consent, forced them to quarter British soldiers, prevented them from trading with the outside world, and much more. At the end, Jefferson declared that King George was unfit to be the ruler of free people, and the colonies ought to be free and independent states. One passage that became very controversial at the Continental Congress was the passage about slavery. As Jefferson listed out the abuses of the king, he stated that King George violated the rights of a distant people by carrying them into slavery. Jefferson was arguing that the king's abuses include allowing hundreds of thousands of African Americans to be enslaved in the British colony. This was a strange thing for Jefferson to include, since Jefferson himself owned slaves and didn't free them during his lifetime. Anyway, the passage was ultimately taken out since Southerners feared that it would lead to the end of slavery, and many Northern delegates didn't like it since they benefited from the slave trade, either directly or indirectly. Some directly sold slaves, others benefited by selling products that slaves made in the Southern colonies. On July 4, 1776, the delegates approved the final version of the Declaration of Independence. This document marks the beginning of the United States officially looking at itself as an independent country. The Declaration of Independence would express some of the founding principles of self-government. One of those principles is the idea that government's job is to protect the natural rights of the citizens, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But you also need to think about what the founders meant when they talked about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They certainly didn't mean it for the hundreds of thousands of slaves that lived in the colonies, the Native Americans who continued to lose their land, or women who would continue to have no say in their government for over a century later. But what is important about this chapter is that those principles of self-government would help guide how the American government operates to this day. And we continue to work towards those ideas that were found in the Declaration of Independence, even if the founders fell short of those ideals. And that's going to conclude this episode of History of Stevens. Make sure you like, subscribe, share, leave a comment in the comments. Peace! Laffy Taffy, I'm so sorry. We still love your jokes. We still love your taffy. We still want you to sponsor us. Please, please, please contact me.